Good evening, dear friends. On the behalf of Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine, I welcome you all to this 11th webinar in the series of Contain COVID webinars. Today, we have got very illustrious faculty to discuss about the COVID-19 vaccine, all that what we need to know. Our first panelist is Professor Randeep Guleria. Professor Guleria is well known to everybody. He is director of AIIMS, New Delhi. The next panelist is Professor G.C. Khilnani. Professor G.C. Khilnani is currently chairman at PSRI Institute of Pulmonology, Critical Care and Sleep Medicine. He is the ex-professor and head of the Department of Pulmonary Medicine and Sleep Disorder at All India Institute, New Delhi. Professor Dhruv Chaudhary, he is the immediate past president of Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine. Plus, he is the professor and head of respiratory pulmonology and critical care at PGI Rohtak. He is also the Dean of Medical Super Specialty Faculty in Rohtak. He'll be joining shortly. Professor J.V. Peter, he is the Director of Christian Medical College, Vellore. Dr. Sandeep Rai, Dr. Rai is Professor Sanjay Rai. Professor Rai is the Professor at Center for Community Medicine, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. Professor Ashish Bhalla, he is the Professor in Department of Internal Medicine, PGI Chandigarh. Dr. Ashish Khanna, he is a staff intensivist and anesthesiologist, Associate Professor of Anesthesiology and Section on the Critical Care Medicine and Vice Chair for Research, Wake Forest University School of Medicine in US. And incidentally, he is here in India and sitting with Dr. Bhalla, Professor Bhalla. Dr. Om Srivastav, he is consultant, infectious disease and HIV in medicine, Jaslok Hospital and Sir H.N. Reliance Hospital, Kasturba Hospital at Mumbai. Dr. Rajesh Pandey, he is senior director and head BLK Hospital at New Delhi. He is also General Secretary elect of Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine. And last but not the least, Dr. Sanjay Verma, she is Professor of Pharmacology. She is Member Secretary, Institutional Ethics Committee of PGI Rohtak. And today's moderator is our young, energetic General Secretary, Dr. Arindam Kar. So, Dr. Kar, please hand over to you.
Yes, sir. So, welcome all of you, all the senior panelists and all the renowned and esteemed persons of the Indian and as well as US healthcare. So, I specifically wanted to go and have a live discussion and an open forum. Questions may not be always directed towards any particular. We might start with some particular panelist, but everyone is open to give their opinion about it. And then we will be also taking questions, live questions from a lot of the participants who are viewing us both in the Zoom platform as well as the Facebook Live. So my first question, it's again an open question. Please feel free to answer that. We have many different types of vaccines, right? So if someone can please elaborate just to start the different types of vaccines. I know it could be a repetition, but it would lead to our subsequent discussion. And whether any vaccine, any type of vaccine has a better efficacy than the other. So whether it's an mRNA or a vector-based vaccine or any other types of vaccine. Yeah, any one of you, maybe Guleria sir can start. Sir,
thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. I think whenever we look at vaccines, we're looking at three broad things. One is the antigen that we look at that is going to inside the antibodies, the platform, and the route of administration of the vaccine. So these are three broad things that one looks at. As far as COVID-19 is concerned, the antigen is the spike protein, which has been identified as being the most effective in terms of producing an immune response and being more immunogenic. So that has been used as the antigen for all of the vaccines. The platforms are different. How do you deliver the vaccine into an individual so that it can lead to antibody production? That can be using, in the traditional way, what we used to use, an inactivated whole virion vaccine, which is what Covaxin is. It can be now using the new technology, which is the mRNA vaccine, which is what Pfizer and Moderna is, which uses the mRNA to incite the antigen production inside the person, and that leads to subsequent antibody formation. It can also be what we call the viral vector vaccine, which is what we have as far as Covishield is concerned, which uses a chimpanzee adenovirus vector. So it's a non-human adenovirus vector, and that's why the vector may not itself cause a significant and may not have significant immune response in terms of protection. Then we have the Sputnik vaccine, which uses the human adenovirus, and the first and second dose use a different vector as far as the Sputnik is concerned, but this is also a viral vector vaccine. We have other vaccines which are then using various things, the VLP, the virus-like particle, which uses the virus-like particles which can be given in the terms of the vaccine causing an antibody response. So these are broadly the types of vaccine platforms that are there. There are others which are also being looked at. You have also live attenuated vaccine, which could be looked at, which was there even for which is there for influenza also in the form of a nasal spray. But then the third part is the route of administration. For most of our vaccines, the route of administration is the intramuscular route. There is also the route of administration which is being looked at in the form of a nasal spray, because that will also incite a local mucosal immunogenic response, which some people argue may also be effective
for the subsequent infection. Yeah.
So these are the platforms in brief. If anyone would like to add on to that, more than happy.
Peter sir, Sanjay sir, anyone?
So can I add one thing?
Yeah,
subunit vaccine also, Novavax, and
yeah, already Dr. Guleria narrated everything almost. So there are total 15 vaccines approved by various regulatory authority all over the world, and majority are either inactivated. 2 are messenger RNA, Pfizer and Moderna. These are the messenger RNA. Inactivated are 4, 1 from India and 3 from China. So 4 plus 4 are vector. 1 from AstraZeneca, Oxford. In India, Serum Institute is manufacturing that. And another one is your Sputnik, also from Russia. The difference between these two, both are using adenovirus, but Sputnik, they are using human adenovirus, whereas this AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, or in India, this Covishield, they are using chimpanzee adenovirus. Otherwise, Dr. Guleria has covered everything. So thank you very much.
Peter sir, do you want to add anything? I think, yes, please, sir. Sir, you have to unmute.
No, I wasn't planning to add anything here. I will talk about the clinical aspects.
Dr. Khanna, very quickly, Dr. Ashish Khanna, are all of these different platforms are available in US, or US is sticking to only the mRNA-based vaccines?
So for now, the US is predominantly sticking to the mRNA vaccines, although Johnson & Johnson is available in the US, which is a viral vector.
So you can make a choice. As a citizen, you can make a choice. Which one?
That's an interesting question. So when we first started vaccination, it was first given to people in nursing homes, elderly, and to healthcare providers, right? This was late December, early January this year. At that time, they were very strict about take whatever is available. So both Pfizer and Moderna were rolled out. People were not allowed to make a choice. The only criteria was if your first dose is Pfizer, then your subsequent dose will be Pfizer.
Has to be there.
Right? Now they are more open about you can choose your vaccine, because we are in a state where, there's ample vaccines. In fact, we're in a state now where there is vaccine hesitancy to some extent, where they want people to get vaccinated, but the people, the part of the population that's reluctant.
That issue is also in US. We thought that is our only local indigenous issue.
That's a major issue in the US.
The vaccine hesitance, yeah. A lot of rumors going on. I will come to that, sir. Regarding this, that we... Yes, Dhruv sir. Namaskar.
She was talking about that nasal one, Novavax.
Yes, sir. You want to add, sir?
Dr. Savita was adding it up. Dr. Savita.
Yeah, Savita, madam, please.
I had already said that there is a subunit vaccine also, Novavax, which is coming up. And its counterpart is being made in India also by Biological E. Recently, the government gave them pre-order of 300 crores for that. So that subunit vaccine is also showing good promise as far as immunogenicity and safety profile is concerned. I know about the Indian scenario in the phase 1 and phase 2, it has shown good response. And their phase 3 will be starting soon. And Novavax in America is, I think, going in for emergency use authorization.
So they're going for the emergency use. Yeah. Okay, so very quickly a question for all the general audience, and kindly pardon my ignorance, that how do we measure an efficacy of a vaccine, and how different vaccines do differ in the terms of efficacy? I will again start with Guleria sir and then go to different people.
When we're looking at any vaccine, we're looking at two predominant things. One is the vaccine has to be safe because we're giving it to healthy people and people who are otherwise not having any problem. So we cannot compromise as far as safety is concerned. And the second is it has to be effective. The efficacy which WHO had put as a cutoff was at least 50% efficacy. Now that depends on what you're measuring, neutralizing antibodies, or you're looking at the cell-mediated immunity. Based on that, the trials are done, basically the phase 2 trials and subsequently large phase 3 trials, which is field trials looking at how many people who got the infection did not get COVID who are vaccinated as compared to those who got placebo and did not and got the infection. So that gives you an idea, and that is why the numbers tend to vary, because it depends on the study design and the trial, and the efficacy is therefore calculated depending on how many got infected in the placebo arm as compared to those in the vaccinated arm. Now this is going to become more and more difficult as we move ahead, because it will be unethical to have a placebo arm. And therefore, you will have to subsequently develop what we call correlates of protection. You will have to look at what can we say is good enough to say that if you have a cutoff of so much of neutralizing antibodies, or you look at cell-mediated immunity, looking at that, what will you say is a correlate of protection to say that we are not able to, this is good enough to be an effective vaccine, or you will have to do what we call non-inferiority trials. That is, in the placebo arm, you will give a vaccine and which is currently being used, and you try the new vaccine in
the new one, yeah.
The new one.
So maybe in the future studies, we may not have a controlled unvaccinated arm. It would be compared with the existing things, and then we will come up with a non-inferior. Yes, sir. Group, sir.
One we like to have the view of pharmacologist, and she's also member of the ethics committee, chairperson, doing it. So, Savita, what is your take?
Sir, I think with time, yes, to calculate efficacy in clinical trials will become difficult. But on the other hand, the thing is that when you're comparing two things together, then they should be based on the similar platform. Now, what is happening over here is that different vaccines are being developed through different platforms. So it will not be justified to compare them head on in the clinical trial as far as efficacy criteria is concerned. But now, because many of them have got emergency use authorization, so we are getting good, robust effectiveness data in the real time. So I think that would also be helpful.
And that would be based on your assessment of the titers, right? Antibody titers or cell-mediated immunity. How do you do that? That's what the question is.
Yes, again, that is again an important issue, because as far as vaccines effectiveness or efficacy is concerned, or immunogenicity is concerned, we still think that neutralizing antibody titers are way better and should be the gold standard as of now. As far as immunogenicity
should that be the quantitative titers? Because most of the areas it is used being the semi-quantitative titers.
Yeah, but most of the kits which are being available commercially also, they are doing semi-quantitative, and then they are just checking anti-SARS-CoV titers. They are not checking the neutralizing antibody. So I think they should not be the general public which is using these antibody tests for their vaccine effectiveness. It is very misleading.
So they should have a very clear idea that you have to have at least a semi-quantitative analytics of the neutralizing antibody. Not
yeah, but those kits are not available commercially at present.
Arindam, regarding the future non-inferiority trials that was referred to, I think choosing the gold standard against which the evolving or the newer vaccine may be compared would be an issue. Which one to choose? Do we choose the one which has shown to be the most efficacious, or I mean against multiple vaccines? So any suggestion or opinion on this from the panel?
So if I may just come in for a second,
Yes,
There are
sir.
two important issues. One is, as has been rightly said, what is your gold standard to which against which you will compare it? And that, sir, currently we don't have. So when you're going to compare it, and as was rightly said, you're looking at different vaccine platforms. And therefore, you're not really being able to compare A versus B, because you could argue or complain it's like apples versus oranges. So
Yes,
you will
sir.
have to look at some correlates of protection. Secondly, there is also a lot of interest, which was there almost 6-7 months ago. UK actually approved it. There was a lot of debate in our groups whether we should approve it, which is known as the human challenge trials. The human challenge trial is something which is also something that we need to keep in mind, which is that you give a healthy person a vaccine and then infect him with the COVID virus and then see what happens. Does he get severe illness or not? That decreases your sample size and it gives you an idea. Now, there's ethical issues with that. The human challenge trial can be done in a setup. The argument is it's usually done for diseases where you have a treatment available and you can provide treatment to the healthy volunteers. The ethicists argue that if you look at the risk-benefit analysis in a pandemic, if there are some people who are willing to sort of volunteer for this, and you have all treatment strategies available like drugs and other things, you could take a small group of people who are healthy, give them the vaccine, see that they have antibodies, and then actually infect them in a hospital setting with the virus and see what happens to them. So human challenge trial is being promoted a lot. UK has actually given approval for these trials. But we were not able to do this in our country because obviously it has a lot of ethical issues. So
yeah, exactly the same time that a lot of controversy came out. Practically like you instead of the animal trial, you practically do a human challenge, and a lot of people actually give a simile to what Germans did in World War II. So I think it will be very difficult for us to get. I understand what you're saying.
Follow that Nuremberg
science, it's right. But from perspective ethics, it will be difficult.
Sir, Peter sir want to comment. Yes, sir. Then I will come to Om Srivastava, sir. Yes.
So I think we
Peter,
need
sir.
to step back a little bit when you're talking about efficacy. When you're looking at efficacy of a vaccine, in the first phase and the second phase, you're looking at whether a vaccine has the potential to be immunogenic. Does it produce the neutralizing antibodies? Does it produce T cell and B cell response? That is what most clinical trials do in the first phase. But we are also looking at efficacy in terms of protection. I think
Yes,
protection we shouldn't forget. I mean, we're all talking more about laboratory. Does it protect an individual from an infection or a severe infection or death? Now, the problem with many of the vaccine trials is they were done at different time points of the pandemic. They were done in different cohorts of people and at different time points of efficacy. And that makes it very difficult to compare head on head one vaccine against another. So if you're looking at a lean period of a pandemic and you're trying to look at vaccine efficacy when you have a prevalence which is low, you're going to have a different effect as when we had during the second wave of the pandemic, and our vaccination in India started before the second wave. So it is relevant to compare at the same period, same cohorts before you say relative efficacy. I want to point out to the question that was raised, can we do randomized trials? No, it may be very difficult, but you can do cohort studies. You have cohorts, large cohorts, like we did one in our institution. We had 10,600 healthcare workers. 1,700 chose not to take the vaccination. And you have another 7,900 who took the vaccination. And the beauty of it is April, May, the pandemic hit us. And we found that the protective effect of the vaccine was, you calculate risk ratio, and from the risk ratio, you can calculate the protective effect. So it is possible to do quality ethical trials following up large cohorts. That's the point I was trying to make. And efficacy is not only in the lab, but in terms of protection. And trials are not comparable between vaccines.
And Dr. Om Srivastava, sir, your comment, and then I will ask you a very naive question.
I think on the cohort issue, Dr. Sanjay Rai probably has been doing it. After he can also answer that question actually.
Yes,
just
sir.
before Dr. Sanjay comes in, just one quick thing. The problem with cohort is because this was also done for hydroxychloroquine. That we had some people who took hydroxychloroquine who did not.
Yeah. Mostly as a profile access.
The argument there was that those who took hydroxychloroquine were the ones who were more COVID appropriate and were really more conscious. And therefore, there are a lot of confounding factors which will
There are confounders. I agree. There are confounders.
That needs to be kept in mind.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Dr. Sanjay, sir.
Okay, thank you. Actually, my screen is completely black, so I don't know I'm visible or not, I'm audible or not.
No, you're both, sir. You're visible
Okay.
and audible both ways.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, see, what is our ultimate aim? Ultimate aim is to have a very effective vaccine, efficacy in terms of prevention of infection and efficacy in terms of your prevention of severity and death, etc. So all these three components. So as suggested by Dr. Guleria also, that this non-inferiority trial would be a better option. Here we can compare, even we can compare with any vaccine, either is and any platform, because our objective is different. Our objective is to have a clear-cut understanding about this efficacy, prevention of infection, prevention of severity, prevention of deaths. So there is no harm in doing this non-inferiority trials. Otherwise, everybody rightly mentioned that now you can't use placebo because of the ethical issue once you have more than 15 vaccines in the use. So, and for cohort, that can be done, but the best design would be for this type of generating evidence is your non-inferiority trial in current scenario. Thank you.
Okay. Om Srivastav, sir, your take on this, and then I will ask you a different question to start with.
Okay, well, thank you, Arindam, and thank you, everybody. Good evening. I think I'm just going to, I have a couple of points to make here. As Dr. Guleria has so appropriately pointed out, that there is a huge role of cell-mediated immunity in all the patients that we are talking about. So it's not about COVID, it's not about the vaccine, it's about how the patient is going to react. How the patient is going to react is going to depend about 90% on the patient's cell-mediated immunity. So as those of us who are practicing immunologists will agree that CMI, cell-mediated immunity, will be variable factor of clinical impact by about only 30 or 40 causes in any infectious disease. And so to say that, yes, I've got the vaccine, I've done the non-inferiority trial, I've quantified the antibodies, I don't think that we are able to put all of that together unless you have put all the confounders together in place before you come to any conclusion. I think that you're only going to be shooting in the dark. That is one. The second thing is that we talk about neutralizing antibodies, neutralizing without going into the theory of it, neutralizing antibodies, how many of them are your IgG, what percentage of your IgG is going to be persisting in your patient system for 6 months after he's had the infection or he's been given the vaccine. What kind of vaccine was it? Was it a vector? Was it a messenger RNA? Was it a different kind of a route? All of that is going to be impacting on what percentage of your system is going to be having the neutralizing antibodies. So again, this is something that we are trying to measure without actually having a measure of the disease or the protective mechanism. And so we are probably setting ourselves up for a little bit of an error. It'll probably happen, but it's going to happen after a little bit of time. Because if you simply see, what do you do when you give your patient a shot of influenza? You don't call him back in 2 weeks' time and ask him, are you feeling better? Have you stopped having symptoms of influenza? You're probably going to assess this at the end of 1 year or 6 months or somewhere in that duration. This is where we are going to be requiring, after the vaccine has come into circulation, you'll need to probably wait for that amount of time before you can ask your patient, how much better are you feeling? So I think that the whole process of assessing and understanding and making an understanding of how much trouble we are in, whether COVID is here to stay or it has gone away, is going to depend upon the quantification of the immune system and those parameters of the immune system of your patient before you can make an educated, definitive comment on whether your patient is doing well or your patient is still going to be in trouble.
Okay, I will come to Dr. Khilnani, sir. That
Arindam, Dr. Ashish Khanna is raising hands is blocked. Just allow
Yes, please. Yes, please. Very quickly, and then I will come to Dr. Khilnani. Khanna, sir.
Arindam, I just wanted to make one point. There are very many flaws when we are comparing the results of one vaccine trial with the other vaccine trial. as has been already said, that it comes at the lean period of the pandemic. The second thing is the virus is going to mutate.
Yes,
and when the virus mutates, by the time we end up vaccinating a set of population, virus is already mutated. It is far, beyond us. And
I will come to that specific question, sir, that how to keep pace with the mutation of the virus speed.
It's very difficult to keep pace. And I want to make one point. I don't know whether it is politically correct or not. Till the time the pharmaceutical companies exhaust their existing stocks of the vaccine which they have already created, they are not going to change. They've invested a lot of money. They've put up a lot of vaccine for sale. And if you tell them that the vaccine has mutated and may not be effective against the one particular variant, they'll run into losses. So I think you need to have a surveillance like you have for influenza. Pick up 3 or 4 relevant vaccines, and then you can use any platform. You can use a
so that concept definitely we will be discussing that the virus surveillance and constant change of the platform on which the vaccine is being produced. But before that, I will come to Dr. Khilnani and ask that in your opinion, that what would be the span of immunity that a vaccine can induce?
So, like everybody, I think you're asking me a difficult question, but I can only quote studies that so far the evidence is that the immunity lasts only for a period of 210 days. Beyond that, nobody knows. It is also true that after 3 months after the infection, as well as after vaccination, the antibody level immunity starts waning. But majority of experts feel that probably that immunity with the vaccination would last for 6 months to 1 year. And this is based on the modeling, not based on the studies. And it is believed that the immunity to infection lasts much longer and it's much stronger. Probably it will last for life. Thank you.
It will last for life. So you are, and so what would be the suggestion for the second dose in terms of the 2-dose vaccines, and whether we need a booster? So it's an open question.
So there's no question that the booster is required. Question of the gap between the two. It's a very controversial thing, but based on the small studies that were done with the Astra vaccine, if you call it, when the gap was longer, the immunity was longer. But the other question was that if you keep a longer gap, then you make a person only partially protected for this 2.5 months, which actually became very important in this search, because whole lot of patients who got first vaccination,
they got infected.
They got infected, and it is thought that although you get immunity in 3 weeks time, which is 70% of the total immunity, but actually this Delta virus, which caused havoc, for protection with Delta virus, you need 2 vaccines. That's why there's a talk and there's a discussion about rolling back the duration of vaccine. Duration of the gap.
Reducing the gap. Yeah.
Reducing the gap.
Sir, it's an open question. Please, the panelists.
I agree with Dr. Khilnani.
Yes, sir.
This booster dose is under investigation, and currently we don't have sufficient evidence about the need of a booster dose.
So as of now, 2 dosage in a proper duration interval is good enough to give lifelong immunity.
Maybe we don't know. We don't know that will provide
as of
a
now.
lifelong
This
immunity
is the concept we should tell. Yeah.
Yeah, but that may provide a longer immunity, we can say.
Okay, Guleria sir, your take.
I think we need more data. I think the knowledge as far as vaccine is concerned and the immunity is evolving. And I also agree that we need to really look at what we call cell-mediated immunity. There is some data which has emerged from papers which have looked at natural infection and shown that based on the T-cell, memory cell immunity, that even lasts beyond 1 year. And there are memory cells in the marrow which are able to get stimulated whenever there is an exposure to the virus and produce a sufficient amount of antibodies. So there is a possibility that immunity will last for a longer period of time. The question remains, how much will it be in terms of the immunity with newer variants?
Yes.
And will that come down to some extent? And that will really answer the question of will we need a booster dose at a later date?
So, and the question a lot of times our patients are many of our colleagues are asking that if I have a naturally affected disease process, do I need a vaccine? And if so, when it should be?
So if I may start and then we can have comments from others. If you are, so you have two parts of the vaccine. One is the priming and the other is the booster.
Yes,
so
sir.
if you have had the infection, then you've got possibly the priming and you can then take just one shot, which will be the booster shot, and you will get sufficient degree of antibodies. So theoretically, it does seem to be sort of logical that if you have the infection, you may just need one shot rather than having to take two shots. However, we don't really know how much is the protection the infection gives, because we know that you can have a very mild infection and you can have a very severe infection. And we also know.
So if a person who is infected and then he gets the one dose vaccine after 3 months, you are saying that it could be a prime and boost strategy. So it will augment the immunity.
But the rider here is that we have to really see that what is the severity and the extent of antibody that the infection is producing, because even in people with mild disease, the antibody production is not that high. We know that you have people who are asymptomatic also, who get infection, and they may not have that good a response. But I do agree that there is some data which is emerging. We need to look at it more critically in terms of whether the infection itself can also be like a priming mechanism of, and then the first shot can serve as a sort of a booster shot.
Okay,
Dr. Guleria, now the question. Arindam, I'm just taking this liberty asking Dr. Guleria. Now, the other way around, one person has a first shot of vaccine and 3 weeks down the line, not immediately, 3 weeks or 4 weeks down the line has a COVID. So what will be your take on that? Because a lot of people are asking now, sir, I had one vaccine, then I had a COVID. Should I go for the second shot or not?
Okay, so now you're reversing it that you now have the vaccine, the booster shot. So it's difficult to say if you had it between just 3 weeks, it's a little bit of a lesser duration. You would like to have a little longer duration for the between the prime and the booster dose. Most people will argue with you, why did I get COVID since I've got one shot of the vaccine?
That is true. But the question is, if infection can be priming, we do expect that the vaccine should also cause.
Let me reframe your question. Your question is that if within 3 weeks' time a patient gets infected, whether we discard the first vaccination, should we go for again a schedule of 2 vaccination or only take the second dose only? And if so, at what duration?
No, Dr. Dhruv is saying there's no need for the second dose. You've got the first dose and your booster is the infection that you've got.
Okay. Any comment from the other panelists?
Arindam, Ashish,
I want to.
Please go ahead. Ashish, you have to grab the opportunity. Otherwise, if you raise the hand, you will not get time. Please.
Okay. So I wanted to just go back a few steps to what Dr. Guleria was saying about asymptomatic infection and the need for vaccination. I think there is an important public health message in this as well. And I know we're not talking about this, but in the US, we have struggled with this concept because, like, I work in an ICU and I have a lot of ICU nurses who don't want to get vaccinated because they feel that they have already been exposed, that they have at some stage in the last year and a half already been exposed to enough COVID around them.
And they have a naturally acquired immunity.
Yeah. So I think it's okay to say, well, you had symptomatic COVID, so you can delay vaccination. But when the general public reads this, then they misinterpret it and they feel, oh, I had fever 6 months ago. Maybe it was COVID. Oh, I don't need to get vaccinated anymore. Or healthcare providers, at least in the US, we're having a major struggle with this. Healthcare providers who work in settings where they're surrounded by COVID patients, some of them are refusing to get vaccinated because they feel that they have already been exposed to enough COVID and they have enough, without testing themselves, they feel that they have enough antibodies in their system. So I guess what I'm trying to say is when we make statements like delay vaccination or, infection is a substitute for vaccination, I think we've got to be careful about the public health implications because we are a group of people who know the science. The general public outside does not know the science.
And we should lead by examples.
This is a substitute. I still don't think it's a substitute for the general public.
Dr. Peter, sir, and then welcome.
Yes. So I think, as Dr. Ashish was also saying, we need to step back one step to ask this question. Are we looking at it from a public health perspective or from an individual perspective?
Right, sir.
If you ask me from an individual perspective, I know that 2 doses offer more protection than 1 dose.
Right, sir.
And the ideal interval may be 6 or 8 weeks. We don't know, but that seems to be ideal. But when you're looking at a population, a huge number who are vulnerable and at risk, you may want to choose the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So if you have limited stocks of vaccine, you're not able to ramp up the vaccination quickly, you may focus more on giving at least 1 dose to the vulnerable population as quickly as possible, and thereby delay the second dose a little bit so that at least a large set of population is vaccinated. It's a little controversial, but you must also look at it from the public health perspective. What is your objective? Protect as many people or increase the protection for individual people?
Limited number of people or the individual people. Yes.
Yes.
And in that public health decision, do you think it would be also included that already infected people may be deferred for the vaccination?
Possibly, and I think the decision to defer it for 3 months is appropriate in this scenario. But I agree with the other panelists that it does need a booster. From our understanding of infection and immunity, it does need boosters.
Pandey sir, your experience with the healthcare worker. Yes, sir. Sanjay sir, I will come just after Dr.
Okay,
Pandey.
sure.
Pandey sir, unmute yourself.
Looking at the way the discussion is going, see, the problem is we do not have all the answers. And initially, if you look at what India did in terms of vaccination, we followed the WHO recommendations that, healthcare workers, frontline workers, and then the elderly should be done. As a result, a large number of youngsters were left unimmunized, and now we have a shortage of vaccines. So these are, something, the strategies are based on the fact that something is better than nothing. The other question is, I agree with Dr. Peter that we have to possibly give 1 dose to all. Now, second question that you raised in the beginning is about the virus mutating. Now, this issue is being looked at, and the existing vaccines, they are looking at the efficacy against the mutated versions also, and they have been reassuring. Possibly they may have to, continue their research and modify a little bit of whatever, platform they're using in terms of, providing efficacy against the mutant. And then it can be given in the form of a booster shot. That's, yes, you have been vaccinated, but now we have a new mutant, so you need to take a booster. So that could be one way, but you could also have a very bad scenario where the vaccine becomes completely ineffective. So the vaccine is finished. It doesn't work, whatever modification, permutation, combination you try, it doesn't work against the new mutant. So that could be an issue. Time will only
then we
tell.
would have to come with an entirely new batch or a new vaccine based on the mutated variants. Absolutely.
That's where
you see my question, Dr. Pandey, and I think Dr. Sanjay will also talk about. Dr. Guleria is there. My question is, when we are using a vector-based vehicle for this, my worry is another one. And Dr. Om is also there, so I would like to have their opinion on it too. Is that when you're giving a vector-based thing, we are actually getting antibodies against the vector also. We are getting the active antibodies against the inserted sequencing. So how can we use the same vector subsequently in terms to have an efficacy of that vaccine? Because that question is also going to be important. And unless and until we look at it, it will be very difficult for us to say. And that could be one very big reason later on, if we want to use the same platforms, particularly vector-based platforms, for revaccination or annual vaccination, in case if it happens.
So let me just come to the first point that you made, Dr. Dhruv. They are very important questions. I can't tell you how significant I feel all the questions you're asking right now. Without trying to be the devil's advocate, let me just put through some facts that have turned up only yesterday, as recently as yesterday, okay? As compared to all the other strains that we're looking at, and Dr. Guleria Please correct me if I'm wrong. The Delta Plus strains, there are about 165 or 169 point mutations that have been described as of yesterday, of which about 8 or 9 such mutations have been described in India from, I think, Karnataka, Telangana, those parts of India. Now, how much of this is relevant? Because India is testing 0.5 of its viral samples right now. In 0.5 of its viral samples, if you have found 8 mutations, then I would think there is a cause for worry, because the COVID-19 mutates once every 11 days or 12 days, based on some of the studies that I have seen from some authorities here in India. That's the problem that we are dealing with. If the virus is changing every 11 days and you've got a Delta Plus, which is already present in India at this time, what are we going to be looking at the end of December or the beginning of March or maybe May of next year? That is the first thing. The second thing is, if you look at the data that came out again yesterday, both Moderna and Pfizer, their theoretical efficacy was sitting in the 90%, but the efficacy of both these vaccines, as of the report from yesterday, is somewhere between 80 and 65 or 60%. Already that efficacy appears to have dwindled based on what we are seeing on paper. And that is almost certainly going to be different when we look at the efficacy in real life. So the question Dr. Dhruv is asking, and I'm quite prepared to say this openly, is that neither do we know all the reality of the changes that are coming with the virus, nor do we know all the reality of how good the vaccine is at this time. I think we need to be a little tempered in our approach towards how much protection the vaccine can give in this environment of the virus changing the way it is.
Sanjay sir.
Yeah. See, now this SARS coronavirus 2 is more than 1.5-year-old virus. We have sufficient knowledge, not all knowledge, but I can say we have a lot of publications and published in very high impact journals like Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, etc. And for this natural infection, based on all these published literature, more than 50 publications are available. I can say that a natural infection is providing better and longer duration of protection. Even if you compare with any vaccine, this is providing better and longer duration of protection. Just I'm giving you an example of one published in New England Journal of Medicine a few days ago. This in Nature one appeared in Nature. That information, as per the Nature, they said that most probably this will provide a lifelong immunity, but that is the probability. But the New England Journal of Medicine article published in December this last year, almost 5-6 months ago, they followed up 12,000 healthcare provider for almost 7 weeks and in 7 months, 31 weeks. And at the baseline, there were 1,177 positive healthcare provider for the IgG, and every 15 days they tested. And even after 7 months, only 2 were RT-PCR positivity, none developed any symptoms. So if you convert into efficacy, although that paper has not calculated the efficacy, but if you calculate the efficacy for the prevention of severity and symptoms, even after, at 7 months, almost 100% of the natural infection, and that too at a very large sample size. 1,200 is a large sample size at the baseline. All these vaccine trials, almost 5 to 10 or maximum 50 in positive groups. And if you calculate against the prevention of infection, that because only 2 got RT-PCR positivity, and in another group almost 200 something. So it's almost more than 95%. So based on all these evidences, and this not only evidences, some observation also, like if you recall last year during March, April, the hot spot for not for only our country, for the entire world was our Dharavi, the biggest slum area of Dharavi. The maximum number of cases were reported from one geographical area, what happened this time? This time Dharavi was not the hotspot. So even after 1 year, now it's more than 1 year, during this highly infectious strain, even that was Dharavi never reported large number of cases or large number of deaths. Majority of cases this time in Mumbai reported from your high-rise buildings, etc. So in nutshell, I can say your natural infection is providing better and longer duration of protection. So in current scenario, there is no need to vaccinate those who had infection in the past. Till such time, if you generate any data that will provide a better protection, then it's okay.
So
Currently, we don't.
That's quite a strong statement and contradicting to the notion that everyone should get vaccinated, even who are infected.
See, other notions are based on the assumptions that after natural infection, so one dose will provide.
I will come to the other day. Dr. Khilnani sir, do you agree?
I totally agree. I rarely disagree with Dr. Sanjay because I have had several programs with him. Our experiences, if I like, he is anecdotal, I'll also be anecdotal because we are treating a lot of patients with COVID. If I recollect in last 1 year, how many patients I have treated who have had second infection, I can count on fingers. How many patients I have treated after vaccination, full vaccination, they are huge. And there are more than 3 crore patients in India who have got infection. Those are documented, but actual could be 20 crore or something like that. Still the second infections are minuscule, whereas after vaccination, we are seeing infection all the time. So what I want to emphasize, this is my feeling, not based on any data, that natural infection provide far
so natural immunity is longer lasting and better efficacious.
Yes.
So do all of our panelists agree with this, or someone has a different take?
I think there is data also to support this. Data from ICMR looking at the entire people who have tested based on their RT-PCR testing suggests that the secondary reinfection was only around 3 to 4%. Very few persons, they could say, had reinfection. So natural infection gives you good amount of immunity, and that is why we are looking at this whole concept.
Sir, does it hold true for the mutated strain also?
So this data has been looked at even during the second surge also,
right,
where
sir.
It was actually because of the alpha and the delta variant. So
right,
that
sir.
should help support it. But as has been said, we don't know what the future will be. So how will the virus change and how will it really evolve is something that is there. But as
so we can take some solace from that the natural immunity is quite robust and correct. It could confer us a long-lasting immunity. Very quick question on this, sir. As you are telling about the prime and boost, can we have a concept of heterologous prime and boost? I heard you in one of the programs that you said, not officially, right, that it could be a possibility that we can have 2 different vaccines which might give a better immunity. So the concept of heterologous prime and boost.
So heterologous prime boost is a concept which has been tried for previous vaccines also. It has been tried for Ebola and found to be effective. There has been studies which have been done, some by default, because in Spain, what happened was they gave the AstraZeneca vaccine and then it was put on hold because of the vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia side effect. And in some people, therefore, they gave the Pfizer vaccine. There are trials also going on in UK where they've already done the trials where I think it's around 600 people that they've given AstraZeneca first and then subsequently the Pfizer vaccine as a heterologous mechanism. And in another group, AstraZeneca followed by the Sputnik vaccine. The initial data suggests that there's a little bit of reactogenicity as far as the giving the heterologous is concerned. People have a little bit more of fevers and other side effects. But there is some now unpublished data which suggests that probably the immune response is better when you give a heterologous vaccine rather than the homologous one. But we need to get more published data before that can be done. It will be very useful because it will allow you to play with your vaccines for a long time. And then it begs the question that should your booster dose be the same vaccine or should you use a different vaccine? And will that give you better response when you later on talk of a booster dose? I don't think we have an answer to that right now.
I will come to Bhalla, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Guleria, I'm sorry, I'm asking a very, very naive question. You have 2 different vaccines against 2 different spike proteins. one single dose vaccine gives you a protective or let's say vaccine efficacy of 50-60%. Now you introduce a different spike protein with a different platform. You're starting all over again unless you give a whole virus inactivated vaccine, which will have some component of that spike protein, which might be boosted. Or you start with an inactivated vaccine and then you give a spike protein, which might get enhanced. I don't understand that you give two different spike proteins, two different vectors, two different platforms. How are you going to enhance the immunogenic effect?
The platforms are totally different. The platform is a delivery system. I think it's important to remember that when you are giving an antigen, which is basically the spike protein, you are really inducing a much larger response than just it being very specific. That is why we're looking at, let's say, the mRNA vaccine, which is actually just looking at a very precise mechanism, but it gives a very robust immunity as compared to the inactivated or the inactivated whole viral vaccine. Therefore, I think we have to have more data into this, but the studies do suggest that we may actually be able to find some better response because of the cross reactivity which may happen. And the spike protein is what is being used. You are using a larger part of it, which will have some sort of areas which will be common, if I put it in a sort of crude manner.
Dr. Guleria, I have a question. Now, because the second vaccine that we are using is different, and so the effect, do we label it as a booster or it is another priming? I mean, two different priming we are doing.
So in the heterologous study design, which is something which was looked for Ebola and now is being tried for the coronavirus, although we don't have published data, this is all data which has been put out there by the research groups in terms of their preliminary data. The second dose is actually looked at as a boosting dose rather than another priming, because then you will have to again give a third dose if that is required.
Yeah, sir.
Dr. Guleria, I have one question. Can I ask a question, Dr.
Yes,
Guleria?
please.
So we are actually putting a great deal of faith again on one mechanism, which is the messenger RNA vaccines. I understand from the initial studies that came out of the mRNA is that this vaccine is going to freeze by at least 70 to 80% the response of the messenger RNA in the patient who has received the vaccine. So the question that comes to my mind is, what is going to happen to those conditions where the entire disease process is mediated in a patient through the messenger RNA? Is that once that process gets frozen of the RNA, of the messenger part, is that going to be detrimental to those conditions like, say, multiple sclerosis, neurodegenerative disorders, other degenerative disorders, which are then mediated by messenger RNA? And what will be the outcome of the vaccine when it starts to kick in or when it starts to wear off? What do we anticipate in that process?
I think there are two parts here. One part is, I strongly believe that the inactivated virus may be more immunogenic than the messenger RNA because it will cause an immune response at multiple points rather than just at the messenger RNA based spike protein. So in the long run, I feel that the inactivated whole viral vaccine may actually be better rather than the mRNA vaccine. The other thing to remember is the mRNA vaccine incites the cell to produce antigens, which then produce the antibody. But the mRNA actually disintegrates within half an hour. It doesn't stay in the body at all for a longer period of time. There was this huge concern when these vaccines came that this will actually change your entire DNA and have a big major effect as far as other immune diseases are concerned. But the data suggests that this is like stimulating the body and then just it's a nanoparticle based vaccine, and therefore it disintegrates very quickly once it is inside the cell. It doesn't go into the nucleus, and therefore it does not really cause the type of effects that you are worried about.
Sir, in a public concern, should we be worried? Because we have seen in other vaccines also that some of the complications do manifest after years. Is there any possibility of that also, that we might have some complications on a long-term basis, which surfaced after years after getting the vaccine? Is there any theoretical possibility of that?
Theoretically, that is always possible. We know that even when you looked at influenza vaccine, and in post-marketing survey later on, in some countries in the Scandinavian area, narcolepsy was reported to be higher as a part of a side effect of influenza vaccine, which we've been using for so many years. So long-term side effects, especially in certain ethnic groups, which may not have been covered to a large extent in the fields, in the studies, may sometime happen, and we saw that in terms of vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia, which is something that has been reported and is accepted now, that it could be a side effect in certain ethnic groups as part of the AstraZeneca vaccine. It's
Peter sir, very quickly.
Can I just take on a point from Professor Guleria?
Yes.
I tend to concur with him when he says, the whole inactivated virus is likely to elicit a much broader spectrum of antibody response, similar to a natural response. And the way the vaccine is developed is also much more time tested than these new modalities. So I would tend to incline more towards they may be more protective. Now, if you look at antibody surveillance, you find that both the spike protein and the nucleopeptide capsid, as they call it, both antibodies get positive with natural infection, but with vaccine-induced infection, it's only the spike protein which becomes positive. So I'm just adding on to what Professor Guleria said. It's time-tested vaccine manufacturing is inactivated vaccine. It's more likely to be broad spectrum. Only time will tell. These are all.
And it might also simulate an infection also in a more better way.
Yeah.
That would be
problem. Dr. Guleria, in continuation, and Dr. Peter, what you're saying is obviously when you're talking about a science is one part and economics is another part. But having said so, even if you see it with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine also, we're finding the similar sort of a problem in terms of increased clotting. So I think somewhere in this cacophony of vaccines, we have forgotten the role of vectors, which is coming and playing into it. In our own country, we still don't know what is the level of antibodies or the evidence of infections against even for the Sputnik also, because there are few reports which are coming that we do have adeno 26 in India and have an antibody. All these things are going to affect the efficacy of the vaccines. So probably we need to be careful about it, need to be sure. And I agree with both Dr. Guleria and Dr. Peter about it. And this is also, I hope, as a policy planner, Dr. Guleria has seen, Dr. Peter has also seen. Yeah, the question which is coming up is in terms of serosurveillance, which test to choose, how the vaccines are interfering in it, how to decide about it, and what are the seroconversion. So these are the questions. One question is relating to three more questions for which we still need to have an answer.
So we might have to come back for another, multiple sessions to have all the answers. So taking the cue from the complications. So what do you think which we should be worried about the short-term complications of the vaccinations, particularly the thrombotic related or the thrombocytopenia related? I would start with the clinicians, Dr. Pandey and Dr. Kilnani, very quickly. Pandey sir, unmute sir.
Okay, am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah, if you see, most of the side effects have been mild to moderate and they don't last longer than initial few days. And pain, fever, fatigue, headache, some people complain, diarrhea, chills, these are the usual things. And this will depend, the side effects will depend on different type of vaccines. And again, they may not last very long. And the absence of them does not indicate that the person has not got a cell-mediated immunity because of the vaccine. So that is again, that's what we are made to believe. Now, regarding some of the reported complications, I think the West is much more sensitive to report of so-called thrombosis, etc. Like the Spanish example that was given, that they changed their vaccine. In India, possibly we are not able to pick up the data at like serosurveillance or complications. I haven't seen the big data from India. So I do not know there. All vaccines will have some or the other short-term complications. It's the risk versus the harm,
the benefit, the intended benefit
ratio that we have to consider.
Dr. Khanna, your US experience, then I will come to Dr. Khilnani. Yes. Regarding the thrombotic complications.
Right. So the thrombotic complication data in the US came back from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine mostly. And I will again say what you've heard the public health experts say in the US, that the chances that you will, die in an airplane crash, or you will get out of your house and something falls on your head and you will die, are more than the chances that you will get a thrombotic complication from the vaccine. So the message
in terms of public health, please go ahead. No, so don't worry about that part.
Again, is pretty clear that the data is confounded because it is in young females of childbearing age who could have other confounders that would have led to cerebral venous thrombosis or other venous thrombosis. So to say that it is a cause and effect relationship, I don't think we're quite there yet. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is being used in the US, and the message is pretty clear that risk benefit wise, the benefits are still outweighing the risks.
Dr. Khilnani sir, should we be worried about, or we just go ahead with our plan?
No, we should be concerned all the time, as it should be. And with Astra vaccine, there were cases of thrombosis. And taking from where Dr. Pandey left, if I talk about experience after vaccination, some people have had prolonged asthenia, not lasting for 2 days, but 10 days, 15 days. There's another issue that once you get a vaccination and 5 days later you get an infection. So there are two kind of immune responses, and we know that the organ damage is because of the immune response. One is vaccine, other is infection. Whether both happening, coincidentally, has a different kind of clinical profile, we do not know. That needs to be studied. But what we propose.
So you are saying an interesting thing, sir. The person goes for vaccination, he gets infected. So now there are two parallel systems working to incite the immunity: the virus itself, the vaccine itself.
So the clinical profile may be different in that.
So that's because now that we have understood that the epicenter of infection is sometimes the vaccination center itself, right? The way we're doing that. So that's a very interesting thing, that post-vaccination infection, whether the clinical profile can be different because of both the things are inside the body itself, the vaccine and the virus itself. So we need to look at on that part. So I would end.
Arindam,
Yes, please.
I want to make in terms of safety of these vaccines.
Yes, sir.
Being a part and parcel of the adverse event committee of the state, let me tell you very clearly, we are recording the data, and it's not that we have not seen it. The only question is where we are lacking it to demonstrate platelet factor 4 antibodies and then having it. A lot of people we are seeing coming up with the complications, which from the public health perspective is fine, but from individual perspective, it can be devastating, or for the family. Therefore, it is extremely important. One has seen anaphylactic reactions. One has seen thrombotic reactions. One has seen demyelination happening.
Yes, sir.
So therefore, when people ask, we need to talk very clearly the probabilities of these having it. Now, because this is an open platform, so I won't go beyond that. But having said so, by and large, it is safe. But we should take all the precaution and be ready there all the time that anybody can have an anaphylactic reaction.
Sir, can I come in? Sir,
Yes, Balla sir.
I would like at least to congratulate Dr. Dhruv Chaudhary that at least he's admitted that there are complications.
And they're significant. In fact,
sir, I have just one question. I am not worried about the efficacy of the vaccine as I am worried about the safety of the vaccine.
I agree with you.
It's a healthy individual who's a young individual who's getting out of his house, has an 85% chance of recovering with mild COVID infection, has 1.5% chance of dying. He goes and takes a vaccine and it is 100% for him. That's what I have.
That question also Dr. Peter has raised. That the main question of risk versus benefit.
Arindam, please listen to me. Arindam, just give me 1 minute.
Yes, sir.
It's on a public health perspective, it's very good. Saying that you have only 5%, 1 in 70,000 chances of anybody with Johnson vaccine getting a vascular complication. For that individual patient, it is 100%. So I think it is very, very important to address this issue. I am again trying to say that once we start getting the idea of combining two vaccines and increasing the efficacy of the vaccine, we should also look, are we going to increase the complication related with that vaccine? Is it going to be double? Is it going to be exponential? So I think these are the very important points before we go ahead and start combining the vaccine.
And Ashish, partly, in fact, I agree with you, but having said so, policy perspective is always one and individual perspective always we look at it. And similarly, now I had started looking in terms of it, I had what are the endocrinal effect of these vaccines or the disease? Probably we have underplayed it. And somewhere we need to start looking at it, probably maybe, again, very minuscule amount, but definitely people have started coming and asking for those things. I think we need to be very open-minded. We need to, our problem is the collection of our data. So we need to,
that would be an,
I think that is what we need to do.
I think again, can I come in here?
Yes,
Dr. Dhruv.
Yes,
Dr. Dhruv, I'd like to make a quick point here. One of the things that we see, because we are practicing, general infectious diseases and not limited to one particular area, the endocrine problems I have seen in at least 24 patients who have turned up with zero testosterone. They've got issues of infertility, erectile dysfunction, and zero testosterone and zero sperm count. And that has persisted for about 8 months, 9 months, 10 months after they have recovered from COVID. The same applies to women who've got menstrual disorders that has also persisted for 3 and 4 and 5 months, recording very, very, extensive investigation and treatment. This also applies to thyroiditis, pancreatitis, and pancreatitis, which can be life-threatening. All of these are documented in the post-COVID scenario, but it's not limited to this. It also goes into, we've already discussed vascular complications, the thrombotic effects, but it also goes to other system involvement. Lungs, we've already described, sudden cardiac asystole, cardiac deaths. We've also discussed, Arindam and I are seeing them, virtually on a, if not a daily basis, quite frequently on a weekly basis in one of the ICUs where we are both looking after patients. The same applies to at least, altogether 5 or 6 organs that will get involved without any warning, stay involved for a long period of time, and sometimes require drastic measures. And so therefore, the way forward with COVID, even if COVID disappears from our lives, is that there would have to be COVID clinics that will look at each of these systems individually.
Maybe we have to deal with the long-term effects of it. I will request Dr. Govil to add and ask some questions if you need to. So please.
I have
Dr. Mishra wants to say something.
Yes,
Dr. Govil.
Dr.
Govil, you said then I have a question to ask.
Yeah, please carry on.
Just, we don't know who will develop complication after vaccination. So maybe Dr. Guleria or Dr. Om can answer this question. Do you feel there is a specific group of population, a specific risk factor in population, whom we can predict that these patients post-vaccination, this particularly group will have post-vaccination complication, particularly serious complication which we are seeing is neuropathy, convulsion, thrombotic complication. These are the things, 3 or 4 things which are really worrying us post-vaccination.
So susceptible risk group for vaccination, right?
Yeah. Anything? Anybody has an idea? Any clue? Dr. Guleria, Dr. Om, or Dr. J.B. Peter, anybody can answer.
I'll wait for Dr. Guleria to answer first, and then I will speak after that.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay, so sir, my own assessment in these matters is that you need to identify the high-risk people. When I say high risk, there are those patients who've got a state of permanent inflammation. And when I say inflammation, I mean people who are obese, body mass index of more than 29, people who are on immunosuppression. You can never really immunosuppress somebody to the point that their immunity is going to be blunted and that there is going to be some part of inflammation that is going to be persisting, whether it is renal failure, renal transplant, whether it is hepatitis C, hepatitis B, whether it is HIV, oncology, on treatment. All of these situations are situations of permanent inflammation. These are the people who are going to go into complication, either mild ones in the short term, severe ones in the short term, or the other way around. Severe ones in the long term.
But sir, these are the patients who are high risk for infections also.
They are, but then more importantly, in the situation that we are talking about, they are at high risk with inflammation for a number of complications, and they need to be watched even more carefully. Even after the symptoms have disappeared, they need to be watched even more carefully.
I will come to Peter sir and then Guleria sir. Your comment on high risk individuals for
Arindam, I think Dr. Khilani sir had addressed the issue, some of the article, if you'd like to say something. Dr. Khilani sir as well.
No,
Khilani sir?
no, thank you. I have no specific. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Dr. J. Peter sir.
No, I'll pass. I have nothing more to add to Dr. what Dr. Om said.
Anybody has to add? Savita, Dr. Savita or Dr. Sanjay, you want to add something on this? Because this is one issue which we need to look at. We have not looked at all.
This is fine from my side. I have another meeting starting at 9:15, so I had to log out.
We'll wind it up after this.
Thank you very much.
No, I can join after 15 minutes. I have a meeting only for 15-20 minutes meeting. Right.
Okay,
so,
sir. Please.
I can rejoin.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjay.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Deepak sir, your question on
No, I don't have got any question. Once you are finished, Dhruv is finished, then we can wind up the session. Dr. Dhruv, please speak little loudly. Can't hear you.
What I was saying is, what Dr. Om has said, the group of people who have underlying inflammation, and that's what Dr. K.K. Agarwal had talked about it, that who had CRP, no, don't go, etc., etc. You see, these things are evolving the same group of people at the highest risk, which we're talking about. Therefore, I think it is very important for us to look at the risk benefit of it. And in the general public, probably what you're saying may be true, but this particular group also is the one which is most vulnerable. Therefore, who will get it, when will get it, we still don't know. And simply on the basis of elevation of CRP, I think one will not say, unless until we have a very robust data on this thing, that who has got the complications, had an underlying inflammation which was there. But by and large, if you really see it in terms of vaccine, they have their own challenges, and with more and more you are coming up of your variants. It's not that every variant which will be there we have to do it, but we need to look at it as I asked you the endocrinal effect, because I myself faced that question about by a young lady. So, but if we say from the platform that it can cause infertility, yes, in certain select group, we need to know what is the phenotype or endotype of them who are going to be affected by it. Then probably we will be in a better position. Otherwise, it will be very difficult. It will actually derail the whole immunization.
Okay. So before that,
Arindam,
yes, please.
Dr. Ashish, both Ashish Balla and Ashish Khanna, if they can comment something on this, I would like to hear from them.
I think Pandey sir also want to comment after.
Yeah, Dr. Pandey, if you, because this issue is something which I want anybody has some. Dr. Ashish Balla and Khanna.
No, I just wanted to focus, draw your attention to pregnant groups, because we were told that, pregnancy and children, they were excluded from the vaccines trials. And we were told that pregnant women are likely to have a severe disease, whereas the discussion in the RCM group and what we experienced was the pregnant women did very well. Very few of the
there was the exceptionally in general experience with pregnancy was their outcome was extremely well, better than what we have seen in influenza.
That happened in the first wave. That only happened in the first wave. In PGI, we had 550 pregnant women coming, delivering, not even a single one coughed. But now,
and this time?
this was till January last year. This is in January this year. Beyond February, we've lost 5 pregnant females to severe COVID. We never had very significant COVID infection in children. We've had children dying at PGI with severe COVID. So you can attribute it to a different variant of the virus. You can attribute it to maybe a initial asymptomatic infection and overwhelming response in the pregnancy. The next time you can attribute it to anything. But this is the difference. We are going to publish that data, and the first wave and the second wave, pregnant women behave entirely different. And my wife is a gynecologist. She tells me that in last year, she never had anyone who was COVID positive, who had a stillbirth or who had a problem. This year, she's got at least 10 patients where on delivery, the placenta looked abnormal. And they've got the histopathology of the placenta done, which shows velitis. So there is a vascular predisposition, and it will involve, the virus will involve the vessel anywhere, right? Why it is happening now, maybe it is a pronounced effect. Maybe these people had an asymptomatic or a mild infection earlier, and now it is pronounced effect. Brings back me to the same question. With the vaccine, we are heightening the immunological response. Are we creating a monster? If there is a different...
I put another question.
I think we are extending too long.
Yeah.
We need to close it down, sir.
Ashish, I put another question to this, which has been bothering my head. The convention has been that whenever you have an epidemic, usually one used to avoid pre-epidemic or otherwise people used to do it. Now again, the Montagener, the virologist, who put a question. By giving vaccination, are we putting a pressure, evolutionary pressure on
Selection pressure, yeah.
I think these are the questions which are coming up. We need to look at an answer. That is one aspect. But nevertheless, irrespective of the mutant, now we all know there is no difference in terms of effectivity of now the data is coming up. Perceptions were there that younger people had come, no doubt about it. But if you see it now, the data when has started coming up, from the first wave in the second wave, there is practically minimal difference in terms of age groups getting infected or having symptoms, be it children, be it adults, young adult or adolescent or elderly people. But mortality this time relatively is on the lighter side on the elderly. Probably vaccination definitely has some role to play.
But Dr. Chaudhary, do you think that the mortality that India has seen in the last 2 months is a factor of the resource crunch, or is a factor of the virus mortality itself? So the reason I bring that up is when we talk about mortality, I saw the mortality in India, right? People say, oh...
Answer is very simple and straightforward. We thought that it is a problem of the neighboring country, not ours. Because
right. And that is a misconception. That's a misconception.
No, this is no misconception. If you look at the data which was done last year, if you see it today, I hope Dr. Guleria is there and he will correct me if I am wrong. Because we had calculated last year itself the number of patients. I give you an example of Haryana. We had looked at and calculated last year that if the peak occurs, we will be have around 16 to 70,000 patients per day. That is what was our calculation. Last year, our peak when it happened, we had 4,500 to 4,800. One day we had around 5,200 patients. Now, what we did last year and this year, what was the difference? You had a lockdown, you had a gradually opening up. You see the difference. Immediately the lockdown came into it, the infection came down. Therefore, this year, what we calculated last year, we have seen in Haryana now. Means, and it came up with...
So your calculation worked this year in that way.
I think we are drifting from our topic and it's high time to wind up.
Govil sir, please request everyone to have a closing remark and then we close.
To start with Professor Guleria, sir, your closing remarks, sir.
Thank you very much. I think we are discussing vaccines, although we moved on to discuss a lot of other things. Just 2 or 3 things I'd like to say. currently the data that we have does support that vaccines would be useful and should be something that we encourage. I do agree that we are still learning as far as the vaccines are concerned, both regarding how their efficacy, especially against the new variants. Do we need to tweak the vaccine subsequently to cover for the new variants? And do we need to really develop other strategies which may make it more effective? This year is going to be the year of vaccinology. We will have a huge data as far as vaccines are concerned. In terms of the numbers in the second wave, the data that the national data suggests that there was really no difference in terms of younger age group, the older age group as compared to the first wave. An equivalent number of people as in the first wave got the same, the age group was almost the same. It was not that different as far as the national data was concerned. Similarly was the mortality in different age groups. So I think I'd just like to end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Peter, sir.
I personally believe that vaccine has saved us for the moment, but whether it will continue to save us in terms of complications due to vaccine, we don't know. But for the moment, we are living a little longer thanks to the vaccine.
Professor Khilnani, sir.
I think I'll be a little political this thing. Last time we said testing. This time it is vaccine, because only the vaccine can save us, despite all the criticism of, high susceptibility and high risk of complications. But those people who have larger complications, those are the ones who are actually more at risk of mortality, like high CRP. Now, I'm not going into that, but I think vaccine is the future of mankind.
Professor Savita.
Yes, sir. So I am a strong advocate of vaccination, because yes, India fared really bad in the second wave, but we need to remember that those who were vaccinated had comparatively milder infection as compared to those who were not vaccinated. And when we are looking at the mutations, so we feel that this time we had a Delta variant and the vaccines were fighting against that. And secondly, now we have second generation vaccines also, and work has already started on them. And so when we actually compare the severity with the COVID infection per se and the severity which has happened after the vaccination, so I think the vaccinations win by a large margin. So I'm a strong advocate of vaccination.
Dr. Srivastava, sir.
Thank you.
I think that all the relevant and the most important things about vaccines have already been said. I don't have anything more to add. Although I do have one quick point to make for all the people who are teachers in this group and all those who will be able to persuade Government of India or their universities to this end. I can see Dr. Rajesh Pandey is putting up his collar there, so I'm very happy that he is listening to what I'm going to say. I think that there should be something that should be encouraged about having a postgraduate course in both COVID and vaccines. This is a good time to have the next generation of doctors understand the importance of vaccines, especially adult vaccinations, and also understand the importance of COVID in all its dimensions. I think that universities and teaching hospitals that would agree with this should look at starting a postgraduate MD or a PhD or a clinical course, both in adult vaccinations and COVID. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With the permission of our dear friend, Dr. Dhruv, I would like to conclude this session. And I'm extremely thankful on the behalf of Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine. I am extremely thankful to all the panelists, Professor Guleria, Professor Peter, Professor Khilnani, Professor Savita Verma, Professor Dhruv Chaudhary, Professor Ashish Bhalla, Professor Sanjay, who has left in between, Dr. Ashish Bhalla, Dr. Rajesh Pandey, Dr. Om Srivastava, and our young energetic General Secretary, Dr. Arindam Kar. So thank you very much. See you all next week, same time.